This episode is for educational purposes only. It does not constitute legal advice or medical advice. The legal and clinical principles discussed are general in nature and may vary by jurisdiction, clinical context, and individual circumstances. Consult qualified legal counsel for case-specific questions. A physician is sitting for a deposition. He has been treating patients for years. He is competent. He is experienced. He is under oath. The plaintiff's attorney directs him to a chart entry documenting a staph skin infection 2 weeks before the patient presented with back pain. Doctor, you see here in the chart, 2 weeks before this visit, the patient had a staph skin infection. Is that correct? The physician answers, yes, I see it. Would you have ordered an MRI if you had known about that? And the physician answers, and this is the answer that changes everything. Yes, I probably would have. One sentence, one concession. And the defense just lost its strongest argument.
That answer is worth spending a moment on because it teaches something about deposition and trial preparation that goes beyond any single case. That MRSA skin infection alone may not be the obvious trigger that leads any of us to order an MRI. In a patient without signs of active infection, no fever, normal white count, no focal deficits, the MRSA history is a risk factor, but it is not the same as a clinical indication for emergent spine imaging. If I were asked that question, I would want to have thought about it carefully before the deposition. I might respond that the MRSA history would have played a role in my differential and my workup, but that in and of itself, without signs of infection, it would not have made me order an emergent MRI. That is a more accurate answer, and it is a more defensible one, because once you say, yes, I would have ordered it, and you have acknowledged that you did not review a critical piece of information that was in the chart, one that would have altered your treatment plan definitively, and you are going to have difficulty recovering from that admission. That is not hindsight, that is preparation. And the question is, why did a competent physician give that answer? What happened in that room that turned a careful clinician into someone who handed the plaintiff their breach argument in a single sentence? The answer is not weakness. It is not ignorance, it is biology.
To understand why physicians give bad answers under oath, you have to understand what is happening inside their brain when they sit down across from a plaintiff's attorney. And the research on this is substantial. The acute stress response operates on 2 timescales. The first wave, the sympathetic adrenomedullary system, or SAM axis, fires within seconds of threat detection. The amygdala detects danger and sends a distress signal to the hypothalamus, which triggers an immediate flood of catecholamines, epinephrine and norepinephrine, into the bloodstream.
And this is where the neuroscience becomes directly relevant to legal testimony. The research shows that even mild acute stress causes what one group of investigators described as a rapid and dramatic loss of prefrontal cognitive abilities. The prefrontal cortex, the part of your brain responsible for working memory, impulse control, cognitive flexibility, and deliberate reasoning, is the most stress-sensitive region of the brain.
The molecular mechanism has been well characterized. High levels of norepinephrine stimulate alpha-1 receptors, and high dopamine stimulates D1 receptors on prefrontal cortex dendritic spines. This triggers signaling cascades that open ion channels and weaken synaptic connections. Network firing becomes reduced and unpatterned. Working memory degrades within seconds.
I want to put that in clinical terms. Your prefrontal cortex is your executive brain. It is what you use to parse a complex question, hold multiple pieces of information in mind, consider the implications of your answer, and decide what to say. It is the difference between System 2 thinking, slow, deliberate, analytical, and System 1 thinking, which is fast, reflexive, and automatic. In a trauma bay, that System 1 response is exactly what you need. You are trained for it. See the problem, act on the problem. But in a deposition, the correct response is the opposite. You need to slow down, not speed up. You need to think carefully, not react quickly. And the stress response that serves you so well on the clinical side is actively working against you on the legal side.
The second wave arrives minutes later. The HPA axis, the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis, produces a surge in cortisol that peaks approximately 20 to 30 minutes after the stressor begins. Cortisol crosses the blood-brain barrier and binds to glucocorticoid receptors concentrated in the prefrontal cortex and hippocampus. High occupancy of these receptors disrupts memory retrieval, impairs memory consolidation, and further suppresses executive function. The prefrontal cortex effectively goes offline, and the brain shifts operational control to subcortical structures, primarily the amygdala and the striatum.
The meta-analytic data quantifies this. A large meta-analysis of acute stress effects on executive function found that stress impairs working memory and cognitive flexibility. The exact capacities needed to follow complex legal questioning and shift between topics. A separate meta-analysis looking specifically at cortisol administration found that cortisol impairs memory retrieval when it is elevated before the retrieval attempt, which describes every deposition where the physician is asked to recall events from months or years earlier while cortisol is actively rising.
And here is the part that matters most for deposition preparation. These two waves create a compounding timeline. In the first 10 minutes, catecholamines are surging and your attention is narrowing. By 20 to 30 minutes in, cortisol has peaked and your working memory and cognitive flexibility are at their most vulnerable. And in a multi-hour deposition, there is no recovery window. You are operating under sustained neurochemical assault with no break in the stress response.
Not all stressors trigger this cascade equally. A landmark meta-analysis of 208 laboratory studies examined what types of tasks actually produce significant cortisol responses. The findings were striking. Tasks that combined two specific features, social evaluative threat and uncontrollability, produced cortisol effect sizes nearly 50 times larger than tasks without those features. Tasks that were merely difficult or effortful, but did not involve being judged or losing control of the situation, produced almost no cortisol change at all.
A malpractice deposition is a near-perfect instantiation of that worst-case combination. The physician is performing cognitively demanding tasks, answering complex questions, recalling clinical details, while being evaluated by opposing counsel, observed by a court reporter, and recorded for potential courtroom use. The physician cannot control the pace of questioning, the direction of the examination, or when it ends.
And it goes deeper than that. Your professional identity is on the line. Your competence, your expertise, the quality of care you provided to a real patient, all of it is being scrutinized and challenged by someone whose explicit goal is to establish that you fell below the standard of care. That is not just cognitive stress, that is a threat to your core identity as a physician. And the research shows that when your sense of professional competence is under threat, your cortisol response is amplified even further. In my deposition, it was a 2 to 3 hour process. I had spent a lot of time reviewing the records beforehand, but what I noticed, and I think the research explains this, is that the plaintiff's counsel intentionally jumped back and forth with the questioning. They did not ask questions in chronological order. I believe they were trying to disorient me with respect to the timeline, to make me lose track of the sequence of events while my working memory was already compromised by stress.
The neurobiological consequence of this stress response has a name in the research literature: the stress-induced deliberation to intuition shift, or PSI-DI model. Under acute stress, the brain reallocates resources from the executive control network, which supports analytical reasoning, to the salience network, which prioritizes threat detection over careful thought.
Experimental work has demonstrated this behaviorally. When participants are exposed to acute stress before instrumental learning tasks, their behavior becomes insensitive to outcome changes. They continue choosing devalued options on autopilot. The research found that neither cortisol alone nor noradrenergic activation alone produced this shift. Only the combination, which is exactly what occurs naturally during the full stress response.
For a physician at deposition, this means something very specific. You start answering from habit rather than careful deliberation. You default to the conversational patterns you have practiced your entire career. Being helpful, being responsive, filling silence, answering quickly, and every single one of those habits works against you in a deposition. Physicians are trained to answer questions. We are conditioned to be helpful. When someone asks us something, our instinct is to provide the most complete, most responsive answer we can. In a clinical setting, that instinct saves lives. In a deposition, it can end your case.
The cross-examination techniques used in malpractice depositions are not random. They systematically exploit every cognitive vulnerability that stress creates. And the research from witness psychology and interrogation science documents these mechanisms precisely. In controlled studies, witnesses responding to cross-examination style questions were 41% less accurate than those answering simple, direct, open-ended questions. A separate study found a 26% overall reduction in statement accuracy under cross-examination conditions, with 73% of participants changing their answers on at least one critical point under adversarial persuasion.
The research identifies several specific questioning techniques that exploit the stress-degraded brain. Directive leading questions: the doctor, you didn't do X, correct? Construction were found to be significantly more detrimental to witness accuracy than non-directive forms. These questions force the witness to process both the medical issue and the linguistic trap simultaneously, at a moment when their cognitive bandwidth is already compromised. The misinformation research, beginning with the work of Elizabeth Loftus, demonstrates that misleading post-event information embedded in questions can alter and even overwrite original memories. In one classic experiment, changing a single verb in a question shifted speed estimates for identical footage by nearly 10 miles per hour. In depositions, attorneys routinely embed contested characterizations into question presuppositions. When you deviated from the standard of care by choosing X, and the physician must catch and reject that embedded premise while stressed, fatigued, and cognitively overloaded.
And there is a technique that I think is especially dangerous, and I want every physician listening to understand how it works. Attorneys will ask a long, rapid series of seemingly benign, obvious questions. Questions where the only reasonable answer is yes. They build a rhythm. Yes, 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 correct, correct. And then, buried in that rhythm, they shift the question just slightly, and you answer yes again before your brain catches up to what just happened. In Season 1 of On the Record, we covered this in detail in our case, Deep Dive. The plaintiff's wound care expert testified, yes, that the Society on Wound Care was the standard of care for wound management. A series of affirmations about professional standards, each one seemingly obvious and harmless. And then the defense counsel found a statement from that very same society, what the expert's own cited authority, that directly contradicted the expert's sworn testimony. That contradiction supported the summary judgment motion, and the court affirmed it. Even an expert witness, someone who testifies professionally, got boxed in by sequential affirmation.
Based on the research and the pattern of questioning observed across malpractice depositions, there are specific categories of questions that physicians should recognize and prepare for.
The first category is what we call control questions. These are designed to keep the witness boxed into short, narrow answers. Leading questions. You were the supervising physician on duty that morning, correct? Yes or no lock-ins. Did you review the chart, yes or no, and either or boxing? Either you saw the MRI result or you didn't. Which is it? These force adoption of a simplified narrative and prevent explanation. The second category is premise trap questions. These build in assumptions that may not be true. Loaded questions. Why did you ignore the focal deficit? That question assumes you ignored it. Assumptive fact questions. When you realized the patient was outside the TPA window, what did you do? That assumes you realized it at a specific moment. And characterization questions. Would you agree that an 11-second chart review is superficial? That asks you to adopt the attorney's framing of the facts.
I want to stop on characterization questions because these are particularly tricky. Would you agree that sounds harmless? It sounds like a reasonable question between professionals, but it is often the doorway to adopting counsel's frame. And once you agree to their characterization, their word choice, their framing, you have ratified it under oath. They will read it back to the jury.
The third category is memory and reconstruction questions. These probe whether the witness truly remembers events or is rebuilding them from the record. Do you independently remember this patient today? Is your testimony based on memory, or only on what you reviewed in preparation? Without looking at the chart, can you tell me what the neuro exam showed?
The research on memory distrust is relevant here. Under sustained questioning about events from months or years earlier, even intellectually sophisticated individuals can develop profound distrust of their own recollections. They become increasingly susceptible to the questioner's version of events. For a physician being asked about a patient encounter from 2 years ago, the combination of genuine memory uncertainty and adversarial pressure creates conditions for what the literature calls compliant false concessions.
And this is critical, like never fake memory. There is a distinction between what you remember and what you know from the chart, and you must be honest about which one you are providing. I do not independently remember, I know this from the chart is a perfectly acceptable and credible answer. Witnesses get hurt when they present reconstruction as memory.
Additional categories include timeline pin-down questions, which commit you to a sequence so that later inconsistencies can be exposed. Standard of care positioning questions, which start with obvious general principles and then slide into case-specific admissions. Documentation attack questions, which target the gap between care given and care documented. And speculation traps, which invite the witness to guess, turning that guess into sworn testimony.
The standard of care positioning questions deserve special attention because they are connected to what is sometimes called reptile theory, a litigation strategy built around safety and best care language designed to sway a jury. But in a deposition, those same questions are being used against you directly. They start with something that sounds obvious. Patient safety is the #1 priority, correct? Or you would want to choose the safest option for your patients, right? And our instinct as physicians is to agree, because internally we always want to do what is safest, what is best, but those questions in a legal context mean something different than the way we think about them clinically. My answer would be more nuanced. Safety is one of many important components of clinical decision-making, and sometimes we are choosing among several options, all of which carry some risk. I would be careful not to give an absolute yes to a question framed that way, because once you have agreed to that abstract principle, the next question links it directly to your case. And the safest option here would have been to order the MRI, correct? Now, your abstract agreement has become a case-specific admission. The key is recognizing that transition from general principle to case-specific conclusion and not conceding when the questioning moves to your specific case. As a general principle, safety is always a consideration. Whether it applies the way you are framing it depends on the clinical facts known at that time. That distinction is where many witnesses accidentally concede breach, and it is where your preparation matters most.
The research supports a structured internal framework that a physician can use before answering any deposition question.
The framework is built around 5 questions the witness asks themselves silently before responding. First, is the premise of this question accurate? If not, correct it before answering. Second, is this asking for memory, reconstruction, or opinion? Label which one you are giving. Third, is this a yes or no question that needs qualification to be truthful? If so, give the shortest truthful answer that remains accurate. Fourth, am I being asked to speculate? If yes, decline. Fifth, am I adopting the lawyer's wording unnecessarily? If so, use your own language.
I want to add something practical to that framework. In my deposition, I kept asking myself 2 questions before every answer. Why are they asking me this? And what are they wanting me to say? That sounds simple. But what it actually does is shift your brain from passive processing to active analysis. Instead of just reacting to the question, which is your system 1, your amygdala, your fight or flight, you are forcing your prefrontal cortex back online. You are engaging your executive brain. And I did not know the neuroscience at the time, but that is exactly what the research shows cognitive reappraisal does. The other thing I learned is that absolute answers are your enemy. Always and never, and I would have, and I would not have. Those are the answers that get read back to a jury. An accurate answer almost always depends on the specific scenario. That depends on the clinical context, or I would need to know the specific findings at that time. Those are honest, defensible answers that reflect the reality of clinical decision-making. Here is a concrete example of what I mean. A question like, "Doctor, when you opened the chart the next morning and saw the abnormal MRI, you had a duty to act and you did nothing, correct?" That question has 5 premises packed into one sentence. You opened the chart, you saw the MRI was abnormal, you had a duty, you failed to act. A safer answer is, I need to separate those points. I am not agreeing to all of those premises as stated. I can address the timing of my chart review, what I knew at that time, and what actions were or were not taken. That answer slows the trap and prevents wholesale adoption of the narrative.
The research draws a structural parallel between the techniques used in plaintiff depositions and the techniques documented in the psychology of interrogation, specifically the Reed technique, which was historically the dominant interrogation model in the United States.
The Reed technique has been characterized in the research literature as starting from a presumption of guilt, with the primary goal of securing a confession rather than discovering the truth. It uses high-stress confrontation, the presentation of evidence out of context, and a strategy called minimization, offering the subject face-saving concessions that actually constitute damaging admissions. The research on false confessions is striking. A meta-analytic review found that minimization tactics, which appear sympathetic but actually function as pressure, increased false confessions compared with direct questioning approaches. In experimental paradigms, false confession rates of 43% have been demonstrated. These are not unintelligent or weak-willed participants. These are people whose prefrontal cortex has been overwhelmed by stress and cognitive load.
The parallel to physician depositions is direct. The plaintiff's attorney presumes negligence. They present isolated snippets of the medical chart out of context to maximize threat. They offer what seem like benign concessions. You would agree that patient safety comes first? That actually constitute admissions. And the physician, whose prefrontal cortex is being suppressed by the same stress physiology we have been discussing, complies. Not because they are wrong, but because their brain has been pushed into a mode that prioritizes escape over accuracy.
The counterpoint from the research is the PEACE model: preparation and planning, engage and explain, account, closure, evaluate, which is grounded in the cognitive interview. This is a non-coercive, information-gathering approach that relies on open-ended questions, free recall, and context reinstatement. It produces significantly more accurate testimony because it lowers cognitive load and minimizes social evaluative threat. But depositions are not cognitive interviews. The environment is adversarial by design.
And that is the core recognition that every physician needs to internalize before sitting for a deposition. The room you are walking into is not designed to discover what happened. It is designed to get you to say things that can be used to establish that you fell below the standard of care. Recognizing that, just truly understanding the mechanics of it, is the first step in protecting yourself.
If the problem is neurobiological, the solution must also address neurobiology. The research identifies 4 evidence-based interventions that can restore or protect executive function under acute stress, each targeting a different vulnerability.
The first is cognitive reappraisal, also called stress arousal reappraisal. A meta-analysis of randomized controlled trials found that reappraisal interventions produced a small but consistent improvement in performance under stress, with larger effects when combined with the stresses-enhancing mindset. A field trial with over 300 participants showed that reappraisal before exams produced lower cortisol, a more adaptive neuroendocrine profile, and improved scores that persisted across subsequent exams. An important nuance: reappraisal does not reliably reduce cortisol in the moment. Some studies found it actually increased peak cortisol, but it improves how the brain uses its cognitive resources under arousal. The promise is not lower your stress, it is use your stressed brain more effectively.
This is exactly what I was doing in my deposition without knowing the science behind it. When I asked myself, why are they asking me this? I was shifting from passive threat processing to active analytical processing. I was reframing the deposition from something being done to me into something I was actively navigating. My heart was racing at the start, but I kept taking slow, deep breaths, and once the questioning started, I quickly settled in. Keeping your brain engaged in analyzing the questions and anticipating why they are asking these questions diverts your attention away from the fight or flight response. It takes practice, but there is a reason it works, and the research explains it.
The second intervention is controlled breathing. A meta-analysis of over 200 studies confirmed that voluntary slow breathing, approximately 6 breaths per minute, increases vagally mediated heart rate variability and activates the parasympathetic nervous system. A randomized controlled trial found that a specific technique called cyclic sighing, a double inhale through the nose followed by a prolonged exhale through the mouth, outperformed mindfulness meditation for mood improvement and respiratory rate reduction. Diaphragmatic breathing training has been shown to significantly reduce cortisol and improve sustained attention.
I used deep breathing exercises throughout my deposition. This is not abstract advice. You can do this in real time in the room without anyone noticing. Before you answer a complex question, take a breath. A slow exhale. That is not stalling, and it is engaging your parasympathetic brake. It is giving your prefrontal cortex a few seconds to come back online. Box breathing, inhale for 4 seconds, hold for 4, exhale for 4, hold for 4, is used by military special operations and first responders specifically for this purpose. It is a concrete, trainable skill that directly counteracts the sympathetic activation that degrades your testimony.
The third intervention is stress inoculation training, a 3-phase approach originally developed for building psychological resilience. The phases are conceptual education about the stress response, skills acquisition including breathing and cognitive reframing, and then graduated exposure to the stressor under controlled conditions. A meta-analysis of 37 studies confirmed that stress inoculation training effectively reduced performance anxiety and enhanced performance under stress. 90% of studies applying this framework in emergency medicine settings showed performance improvement and stress reduction.
I did not know about stress inoculation training before my deposition, and I wish I had. What I did instead, and I spent a lot of time doing this, was mental reps. I worked through all the difficult questions I thought I might be asked, not to rehearse specific answers, but to test and work through how I would use my brain to answer the questions, how I would identify loaded premises, how I would break apart compound questions, how I would resist the urge to give an absolute answer when the honest answer depends on context. That is functionally what stress inoculation is. Mock depositions serve as literal exposure therapy. You subject yourself to the adversarial environment in a controlled setting so that when the real thing happens, the stress response is muted. Your coping skills, the breathing, the reappraisal, the pause, become automated. And that matters because under genuine stress, your brain will preferentially retrieve what is overlearned.
The fourth intervention is implementation intentions. Pre-committed if-then plans that create what the research calls strategic automaticity. A meta-analysis found a medium to large effect size for implementation intentions across behavioral domains. And critically, these maintain their effectiveness even under high cortisol and elevated heart rate, because they bypass the very prefrontal processes that stress degrades.
Implementation intentions work because they convert a deliberative decision into an automatic response. Instead of requiring the physician to think through how to handle a loaded question in real time, when their prefrontal cortex may be compromised, the response fires automatically from a pre-committed plan.
Let me give you specific examples. Before my deposition, I had already decided if I do not understand a question, I will pause and ask them to rephrase it. If a question contains a premise I disagree with, I will say, I do not accept the premise of that question, or that assumes facts I have not accepted. If I feel rushed, I will stop and take a breath before answering. If a question asks me to speculate, I will say, I cannot speculate about that. If a question is compounded, asking me 2 or 3 things at once, I will say, I would like that question broken into parts. These are not evasion techniques, they are accuracy techniques. And there is a tactical advantage when you ask for a question to be rephrased or broken into parts. You are also buying yourself time to analyze the intent behind what they are asking. Sometimes you can disrupt their cadence, and that matters because their rhythm is part of the strategy. I want to be direct about something. It is unfortunate that this process has to be so adversarial. As physicians, our instinct is to educate, to explain, to teach. In a deposition, that is the worst thing you can do. Save the explaining for the trial, where your attorney can walk you through your reasoning in a structured way. The deposition is a chess match. Do not give them any information they did not ask for. Do not volunteer anything. If there are long, awkward pauses after you finish an answer, embrace them. Sit there and look at the camera unfazed. They want you to fill that silence. They are hoping you will think they know you have more to say, and they hope you will start talking. If you catch your mouth getting ahead of your brain, just stop. Make them pull every answer out of you question by question.
Taken together, the evidence supports a structured preparation approach that addresses the neurobiology of the deposition stress response at multiple levels.
Weeks before the deposition, education about the stress response, understanding what your body will do and why. Learning that an increased heart rate, racing thoughts, and difficulty concentrating are predictable biological reactions to catecholamines, not signs of personal weakness, incompetence, or guilt. Learning the stress is enhancing reappraisal, that arousal mobilizes resources and can help performance if channeled correctly. And learning to recognize the adversarial questioning techniques we have discussed, because the misinformation research shows that simply being warned about these tactics cuts their effectiveness by more than half.
That last point deserves emphasis. Just knowing these techniques exist, knowing what they are designed to do, is protective. You cannot defend against a trap you do not see.
1 to 2 weeks before. Daily practice of controlled breathing, cyclic sighing for 5 minutes a day, or box breathing during routine activities. Developing 6 to 8 personalized implementation intentions for the deposition, triggers you're most likely to face. And practicing cognitive reappraisal framing, actively reframing stress arousal as a performance tool rather than a threat signal. Days before, graduated mock deposition sessions with your defense attorney. Start with supportive questioning and escalate to full adversarial cross-examination. Practice your breathing and reappraisal techniques during the mock sessions so they become automated. Video review is valuable. Seeing your own stress responses allows you to calibrate. Day of, 5 minutes of cyclic sighing or box breathing before entering. A brief self-statement activating your challenge appraisal. Your pre-committed if-then plans are active. And the single most important behavioral tool, a strategic pause of 3 to 5 seconds before each answer. There is no legal requirement for immediate response. That pause allows partial prefrontal re-engagement. And it is the difference between a considered answer and a concession.
Here's what I want you to take away from this episode. 5 things you can do to protect yourself before, during, and after a deposition. First, understand what your brain is going to do. The stress response is not a sign of weakness. It is predictable neurobiology. Your prefrontal cortex will be suppressed. Your working memory will be degraded. Your instinct will be to answer quickly and agreeably. Know this going in, and it loses some of its power over you. Second, build your if-then plans before you walk into the room. Decide in advance how you will handle loaded questions, compound questions, questions with embedded premises, and questions that ask you to speculate. Write them down, practice them out loud, make them automatic, because in the moment, your deliberative brain may not be available to generate them. Third, learn to pause, 3 to 5 seconds before every answer. Use that time to ask yourself, why are they asking me this? What are they wanting me to say? Is the premise of this question accurate? Am I about to give an absolute answer when the honest answer depends on context? That pause is not stalling. It is the cognitive equivalent of switching from System 1 to System 2 processing. Fourth, never give absolute answers when the truth is conditional. Always and never and I would have are the words that get read back to juries. Clinical medicine is contextual. Your answers should reflect that. That depends on the clinical scenario, is almost always more accurate and more defensible than a clean yes or no. Fifth, train your breathing. Box breathing, cyclic sighing, extended exhales. Pick one and practice it daily for 2 weeks before your deposition. This is not optional wellness advice. This is a trainable physiological skill that directly counteracts the catecholamine surge that degrades your testimony. Military operators train this for combat. You can train it for a conference room.
The research across stress neuroscience, witness psychology, and high-stakes performance science converges on a single conclusion. The malpractice deposition creates neurobiological conditions that systematically degrade the cognitive performance it demands, while adversarial questioning exploits those vulnerabilities with documented precision. No published studies have specifically examined physician deponents in controlled trials, but the mechanistic alignment across domains is tight. The stress physiology, the questioning psychology, and the intervention science all point in the same direction. And the practical implications are clear enough to act on today.
Here is the bottom line. Preparation is not optional. It is a neurobiological necessity. Thinking before answering is not stalling. It is the single most important thing you can do to protect yourself, your patients, and your career when you are sitting across from someone whose job it is to get you to say the wrong thing. A nuanced, honest answer is always better than a clean concession that hands the plaintiff their breach argument. That is not hindsight, that is preparation.
This episode is for educational purposes only. It does not constitute legal advice or medical advice. The legal and clinical principles discussed are general in nature and may vary by jurisdiction, clinical context, and individual circumstances. Consult qualified legal counsel for case-specific questions.